We've all heard the legend, the sharpshooting scout who rode with General Crook's cavalry, the fearless woman who saved a stagecoach from hostile attack, the tragic lover of Wild Bill Hickok who avenged his murder with a meat cleaver. But what if I told you that nearly everything we know about Calamity Jane was a calculated fabrication written by the woman herself to sell 10-cent booklets on street corners? Today, we're setting aside the dime novels and looking at the hard evidence, the census records, the military logs, and the DNA controversies that reveal the shocking reality of Martha Jane Canary, because the truth turns out to be far more complicated than the myth. We've looked at the DNA evidence behind Jesse James and Butch Cassidy, and today we're turning that same analytical lens on one of the most misunderstood figures of the Old West. Martha Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane, was a master of self-reinvention. In 1896, she published a short autobiography titled Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by herself. For over a century, historians took it as gospel, but when you cross-reference her claims with actual historical records, a very different and much more human story emerges. Today, we're debunking the Scout, analyzing the marriage to Wild Bill, and addressing the Jane Hickok lineage controversy that still sparks debate among researchers. But before we get into all that, let me ask you something. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the evidence, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that real history matters. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Ghosts of the Frontier, because we've got more myth versus reality episodes coming up, including a look at the hidden records of the Herp brothers. Let's start with the foundation of the myth. In her 1896 autobiography, Martha claims she was a scout for General George Crook and served in multiple Indian campaigns. She describes herself as a fearless warrior in buckskins, riding with the troops and delivering dispatches under fire. According to her version of events, she earned the nickname Calamity by saving Captain Egan from an ambush. It's a compelling story, the kind of story that sells booklets for pennies on the street. The problem is that when we look at the military muster rolls from the 1870s, her name is nowhere to be found as a scout. Historical records from the Jenny expedition of 1875 tell a different story entirely. While she was with the troops, she wasn't there as a soldier or an official scout. According to journals from the men on that expedition, she was essentially a camp follower, and she was actually arrested and sent back to Fort Laramie because her presence was considered a distraction to the soldiers. So where did the Calamity nickname really come from? Contemporary accounts from her peers in Deadwood suggest a much less heroic origin. One account suggests that soldiers on the Jenny expedition thought it would be a calamity if she wandered off and got captured by Indians. Another suggests it came from men who courted her affections with warnings that to offend her was to court calamity. What we know for certain is that by 1876 the nickname was already attached to her because the Black Hills Pioneer newspaper announced her arrival in Deadwood with the headline, "Calamity Jane has arrived." Now here's where the birth records get interesting. Martha's own autobiography got her birth year wrong. She claims she was born in 1852, which would have made her about 51 when she died. But the 1860 census clearly shows a 4-year-old Martha Canary living with her parents in Missouri, which means she was actually born around 1856. That means she died at age 47, not 51. Even her tombstone got it wrong. According to historian James Blair, who spent years researching her life, the census data is clear. She was born in 1856 near Princeton, Missouri. By the time she was 20, census records place her in Wyoming, not as a scout, but working in a series of menial jobs. According to some historians, she was likely engaging in prostitution to survive. This wasn't uncommon on the frontier. For a woman alone, survival often meant doing whatever work was available, and respectability took a back seat to eating. If she wasn't a scout, who was she? This is where the reality becomes more compelling than the myth. In 1876, Martha arrived in Deadwood. While the movies show her as a gunslinger and a lawman, the local newspapers like the Black Hills Pioneer paint a picture of a woman who was deeply compassionate but profoundly troubled. During the smallpox outbreak of 1878 in Deadwood, Martha Jane Canary did something the heroes wouldn't do. She stayed. When other residents fled in terror from the disease, she remained and nursed the sick. There are documented accounts of her tireless work caring for dying miners in the log pest house on White Rock Mountain outside town. Town leaders had set up a quarantine area there, and 8 sick miners were essentially left to die. Calamity volunteered to go in and nurse them when no one else would. This wasn't for fame or recognition. There were no cameras, no journalists taking notes. This was the real Martha, a woman of extreme contradictions. The local doctor, Doc Babcock, had to admit there was a little angel of some sort in the hard-boiled. When tending to sick children, he said of her, she'd swear to beat hell at them, but it was a tender kind of cussing. At her funeral in 1903, many old settlers remembered her acts of kindness when there was no other woman in the gulch to help. The reverend handling the service emphasized her charity during Deadwood's early years while carefully avoiding mention of her worldly ways. One witness during the outbreak called her a perfect angel sent from heaven when any of the boys was sick. The miners she saved never forgot what she did for them when the rest of the town turned away, but we have to address the elephant in the room, the drinking. Records show she was frequently arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. To the audience watching this, you understand that the frontier was a harsh place. For a woman alone, survival often meant adopting a persona that was tougher than the reality. Martha wore men's clothes because they were practical and offered a layer of protection in a lawless mining camp. Her tough girl act was a survival mechanism, but it came with a cost. The drinking that helped her cope eventually destroyed her. Now, let's talk about the most famous association in Western history, Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok. Pop culture insists they were star-crossed lovers. Martha herself claimed they were married. Entire novels and movies have been built around their supposed romance, but let's look at the timeline and the actual evidence. Martha arrived in Deadwood in the same wagon train as Hickok in July 1876. The newspaper even announced her arrival on the same day. Wild Bill was murdered by Jack McCall on August 2, 1876, less than a month after they arrived. They knew each other for barely 5 weeks. Hickok's own letters to his new wife, Agnes Lake, written just days before his death, expressed deep love for Agnes and made absolutely no mention of Martha Canary. Hickok had married Agnes on March 5, 1876, just a few months before arriving in Deadwood. In fact, Hickok's friends like Colorado Charlie Utter were on record saying Bill found Martha's company somewhat annoying. When Martha died in 1903, 4 of the men who planned her funeral later admitted that Hickok had absolutely no use for Jane while he was alive. They decided to play a posthumous joke on him by burying her by his side. That's not exactly the romantic ending Hollywood prefers, but it's what the historical record shows. So why the legend? After Bill's death, Martha realized that being linked to a famous gunfighter gave her celebrity status. She began telling stories of their romance to tourists and journalists, usually in exchange for drinks or small change. In her 1896 autobiography, she spun a wild tale of capturing Jack McCall after he murdered Wild Bill, chasing him down with a meat cleaver because she'd left her guns at home. None of this happened. McCall was captured by authorities, stood trial, and was legally hanged in 1877. But Martha's version made for a better story, and better stories sold more booklets. It was a marketing tactic that worked so well, it eventually became historical fact in the eyes of the public. This brings us to one of the most disputed pieces of Jane's history, and this is a topic we love on this channel: disputed lineage and DNA controversies. In 1941, a woman named Jean Hickok McCormick appeared on the popular CBS radio program We the People on Mother's Day. She announced to the nation that she was the secret daughter of Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok. To prove it, she produced a diary, a marriage certificate, letters, a diamond brooch, a lock of hair, and a prayer book with an inscription by Calamity Jane. She claimed she was born in a cabin near Livingston, Montana in September 1873, and that she was given up for adoption to a Captain James O'Neill and his wife. McCormick's radio revelations made her an instant celebrity. She was invited to participate in Wild West celebrations and rodeos throughout the summer. She even traveled to Wisconsin to attend a Hickok family reunion. On September 6, 1941, the U.S. Department of Public Welfare granted old age assistance to Jean Hickok Burkhard McCormick after reviewing her evidence. For decades, this threw historians into a tailspin. However, modern forensic analysis tells a very different story. Historians, particularly James Clare, who wrote extensively on this subject, disproved McCormick's claim by carefully researching when and how her fantastic autobiography unfolded. The diary she produced contained accounts that were demonstrably false. It claimed Calamity traveled to England with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which never happened. It claimed she met Jesse James after his alleged death and that he sang at his own funeral. The diary referenced popular myths and tall tales about Calamity Jane that had been proven false decades earlier. More damning was the evidence that Calamity Jane was functionally illiterate. She couldn't read or write. The idea that she produced this extensive diary with detailed entries over 25 years is simply not credible. Many historians came to believe that McCormick composed the diary herself and was in fact continuing to add and edit pages throughout the 1940s. In 1951, Jean McCormick contacted the Fort Collins Pioneer Museum, asking them to return some of the artifacts she donated. She wrote, "I have a chance to sell Calamity Jane's diary and the other articles I shall name. I've sold everything I possess just to live." Less than 2 years after writing that letter, Jean McCormick died in poverty. Much like the claimants who emerged after the death of Jesse James, the Jean Hickok story lacks the one thing we value most on this channel: verifiable evidence. While we haven't seen a definitive DNA test debunking Jean McCormick specifically, the historical paper trail or lack thereof speaks volumes. The geographical locations mentioned in the diary don't align with where Martha was known to be during the alleged pregnancy. The timeline doesn't work. The documents show signs of forgery. Martha did have children, but the evidence points to them being fathered by men other than Wild Bill Hickok. The story here is complicated because Martha had relationships with multiple men. In 1888, she married William Steers, a railroad brakeman in Bingham County, Idaho Territory. There's an actual marriage certificate dated May 30th, 1888. Steers was reportedly physically abusive, and their relationship was tumultuous. She gave birth to a daughter named Jessie in 1887 before she officially married Steers. She also had a son who died in infancy around 1882. Martha also claimed to have married Clinton Burke in August 1885 in El Paso, Texas, and her autobiography is even authored by Mrs. M. Burke. The problem is there's no evidence she was in Texas in 1885. Newspaper reports show she was actually in Wyoming during that time. According to Britannica, she lived with Clinton Burke for 7 years before they officially married in 1891. So, the timeline of her marriages is murky, and she likely considered multiple men her husband, even without legal marriages. Jesse's story is interesting in its own right. 30 years after Martha's death, Jessie began making inquiries about Jane, whom she thought was her grandmother. By 1942, she'd changed her story, perhaps at Jean McCormick's urging, claiming that both Calamity Jane and Belle Starr were her aunts. Neither claim was true. Historian James Clark theorized that Jessie, who had no birth certificate, said what she had to in order to receive financial assistance at her last residence in California. She appears to have finally learned the truth by the time she died in 1980 because her death certificate correctly lists her mother's maiden name as Canary. It was the last word on a true child of one of the wildest women of the West. Martha's later years were marked by struggle. Beginning in 1895, she toured with various Wild West shows, performing sharpshooting tricks on horseback and selling her autobiography to audiences for pennies. But her drinking cost her these jobs repeatedly. She was fired from tours in Minneapolis, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. In 1901, she was hired to appear at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, but lost that job too due to her excessive drinking and erratic behavior. By 1903, her hard life had caught up with her. In July of that year, she arrived at the Callaway Hotel in Terry, about 7 miles south of Deadwood. She was in terrible shape from decades of hard living and alcoholism. On August 1, 1903, Martha Jane Canary died at the age of 47, though her tombstone incorrectly lists her as 51 years old, and even gets her birth date wrong. Her final wish was to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery. The men of Deadwood granted that wish, though, as we've established, some admitted they did it as a joke on Bill, who couldn't defend himself in the afterlife. Calamity Jane wasn't the superhero the dime novels portrayed. She was a woman struggling with addiction, poverty, and the crushing weight of frontier life. She was orphaned young, had minimal education, and faced the downward push that many frontier women experienced in the late 19th century. But she was also a woman who chose her own path, created her own legend, and showed incredible mercy to the sick when no one else would. She rose above her challenges with energy, endurance, and fortitude, Even if she couldn't always rise above her demons, the myth she created was her final act of survival. In a world that had little place for women like her, she wrote her own story and made sure people remembered her name. Was it all true? No, but in many ways, the fiction she created was just as important as the facts she lived. She understood that in the American West, the legend often mattered more than the truth. What do you think? Was Martha a calculated liar or just a woman doing what she had to do to survive in a man's world? And do you think we'll ever see a DNA test that finally settles the McCormick lineage claim once and for all? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these historical mysteries. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the evidence, make sure to hit that like button. It really does help the channel grow and tells YouTube that real history matters. And if you haven't already subscribed to Ghost to the Frontier, hit that subscribe button right now. We've got more myth versus reality episodes coming up, including a look at the hidden records of the Herp brothers and the truth about Doc Holliday's final days. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.